So Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, and an Albanian all walk into the same bar. There is no joke here. We need to leave now or we're all going to die. Yugoslavia, the most controversial country in recent history you probably haven't heard of.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
Because it kind of speed ran its own non-existence through extreme nationalism, shitty governments, and cleansings of the ethnic variety. I mean, these guys still, to this day, they all hate each other. They still have generational bloody beef. Which is crazy to me because all of these people live a whopping 30-minute drive away from each other. But anyways, let's talk about the wars that broke Yugoslavia. So after World War I, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was formed in 1918, later named Yugoslavia in 1929. Here, just for context, I'll pull up a map for you. Oh, fuck. Sorry. We really got the breakup of Yugoslavia before we got GTA 6. Anyways, here's the actual map. The country was made up of various states and ethnic groups, where current-day Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia now exist. But they used to be like a conglomerate, like they were all together. But back then, the different ethnicities, they mixed in a lot. Croatia had a sizable Serb population, autonomous Serb states like Kosovo had a lot of Muslim Albanians, and Bosnia contained a lot of Serbs and Croatians. Real quick, if you're liking the video and you're not subscribed, make sure to click that subscribe button, like the video, maybe leave a comment, and if you want to support the channel, go to musclepill.com and pick up some sweet, sweet merch. All right, back to it. During World War II, Yugoslavia was invaded and divided by Axis powers. Post-war, a guy came along by the name of Josip Broz Tito. He stepped in and established a socialist federation that aimed to suppress the nationalist sentiments between all these different groups. And honestly, he was fairly successful in this, but his government was running on borrowed time. Because in 1980, nature dropped the pipes on Josip Broz Tito, and he died. This led to a huge power vacuum, economic collapse, and the rise of those same nationalist sentiments he sought out to suppress. Josip's government was basically putting a great value brand band-aid on a sucking chest wound. Because the economy was dog shit after he died, the IMF, or the International Monetary Federation, they loaned Yugoslavia some money, but that loan came with some stipulations, and those stipulations turned out to totally chunk the state's economy. They increased unemployment and decentralized the Communist Party. The IMF required the government to take expenditure cuts, repay debts, and liberalize their markets exponentially. They also demanded a 5% cut in government spending and restricted the federal government's access to credit from their own central bank, so they couldn't bail themselves out anymore, which is what they were doing. The poop butt economy got people all riled up, looking for answers and change naturally, which gave rise to political leaders like Slobodan Milosevic, who was out of Serbia, and Franjo Tuđman, who was out of Croatia. Both of these examples were riding the wave of nationalist ideologies that was making its way through Yugoslavia. So of course, because of all the nationalist sentiment, ethnic tensions got really hot, mainly between the Serbs and everybody. You'll see as we go on that the Serbs are kind of the biggest common denominator in these conflicts. Not to say they aren't all bad, because they all do some awful things, but you know. In 1987, Milosevic created a narrative of Serbian persecution throughout Yugoslavia and became a hero to the Serbs by vowing to protect the Serbian way of life. And this sparked a massive protest movement all over Yugoslavia that aimed to remove political leaders and unite Serbia as a whole. By 1989, these protests succeeded in giving Milosevic power over a sizable chunk of Yugoslavia, but Croatians prevented those protests in Slovenia. Sanctions imposed on Slovenian goods caused Slovenia to leave the Yugoslavian Communist Party, which gave the green light to others who wanted to secede from the Yugoslavian state. Subsequently, independent parties began taking power around Yugoslavia, ultimately leaving the Communist Party in total shambles. But Serbs living in places like Croatia thought that all these different independent states would end up committing atrocities against them, so they formed militias and began to prepare for war. This takes us to our very first war, one of many that we'll talk about today. Slovenia and the 10-Day War. So Slovenia declared their independence in June of 1991, to which the federal Yugoslavian government said, Nuh-uh. Leading to a brief 10-day conflict. Preparations for the war started years prior, of course, in 1989, when Slovene police forces prevented those Serbian protests from reaching their capital of Ljubljana. This caused the Serbs in Slovenia to unite and take up arms. Of course, the now Serbian-controlled Yugoslavian Federation saw this and reinforced those Serbian paramilitary organizations within Slovenia with the Yugoslavian People's Army, or the JNA. In total, between the JNA and these paramilitaries, there was around 23,000 Serbian personnel. Slovenia's territorial defense forces, combined with their national police, consisted of around 45,200 bodies. The Slovenes knew they wouldn't be able to deter the JNA, especially in direct conflict, so they do things like trap tank columns by ambushing and destroying the lead and rear vehicles, and utilize hit-and-run tactics using SA-7 Grail anti-aircraft missiles and German armbrust anti-tank weapons. They did what everybody these days and adopted asymmetrical warfare strategies, otherwise known as good old guerrilla warfare.
To volim da čujem. Yes. Tako ćemo da radimo i to da napravimo. A ovdje mene sada vrlo jasan alija u vrlo rezultatom, moram da mu kažem. Mi sad idemo, više nikome nikakav popust, a ako će da se biju, tu smo. Nema se u pičku lepu materinu, kogod hoće da se bije, tu smo i jači. Ko hoće za alijom da se s nama bije, neka izvoli, izgubit će.
The 10-day war came to a close as Slovenia agreed to postpone their independence in return for a ceasefire. The Yugoslavian government agreed, but they turned their sights more towards Croatia, which allowed Slovenia to kind of break away and become independent in the background of what's going to come up next. So damage done in the 10-day war, 45 Yugoslavian soldiers KIA, 146 wounded, and 4,600 captured. On the Slovenian side, 19 of their troops were KIA and 182 were wounded. But this takes us to Croatia, because Croatia declared independence around the same time in 1991. Again, being the common theme, the Yugoslavian government and all the Serbian minorities in Croatia contested this independence, wanting to stay in the Yugoslavian state. They really told the Croatian government, I know you are, but what am I? And the answer to that was also independent. So these Serbians claimed a bunch of land in Croatia and began to expel Croats from their proto-state. They named this state the Republic of Serbian Krajina. Kind of a cool name, I'll give them that. But in typical Balkan fashion, a horrific and brutal war ensued, one with massive amounts of war crimes. Yeah! War crimes! Yeah! War crimes! It all started off with armed incidents within those majority Serb areas where Serbians attacked Croatian police units. Josip Jovic is reportedly the first officer to be unalived by the Serbians. I don't really know how YouTube likes me to talk and say words, so bear with me. We'll see if I can get this video monetized. The attack started to grow in volume and severity, and by the end of April 1991, there were over 200 usages of explosive devices and 89 attacks on Croat police. The Croatian government decided that they needed to step it up a notch, and so they began supplying their police with heavier arms.
Of course, every now and then you want to knock it up a notch with a blast from your Spice Weasel. Bam!
They also decided to just merge them with their Croatian National Guard, and this kind of just shifted into the independent Croatia's actual standing army over time. On June 25th, 1991, Croatia officially dissolved their ties with the greater Yugoslavia, to which the Yugoslavian government took personally. So a few months later, in August of 1991, the JNA, or the Yugoslav People's Army, besieged the town of Vukovar in eastern Croatia. Their strategy mainly consisted of mass indiscriminate shelling using artillery, and this understandably caught the international eye. Journalists from all over the world were attending to and documenting this event, and that'll be another common theme within these wars, is it's all kind of like peered upon by the international community. I'm sure you can put two and two together and see that the international community would come to really not like this method of indiscriminate shelling. The siege lasted a grueling 87 days, and this was only the first of a full-scale attack on the eastern parts of Croatia. After this, Croatian forces decided to blockade various JNA barracks, weapons, depots, and other facilities that had been set up around Croatia. Obviously, the Croatian army had pretty much just been formed, so they didn't have too much, and so the goal of these blockades were to neutralize those positions and secure arms and ammunition for themselves.
When I joined the Corps, we didn't have any fancy schmancy tanks. We had sticks, 2 sticks and a rock for a whole platoon, and we had to share the rock.
And it was honestly largely a success. It's pretty impressive. From my research, the Croatian army managed to capture 250 tanks, 400 artillery pieces, and 180,000 small arms. This was a huge boost in the capabilities of the Croatian forces. Man, I can't possibly imagine, how did the Serbs and the JNA just let the Croatians drop the pipes on them like that? That's embarrassing, frankly. I personally would not take that. The Yugoslavian forces tried to occupy the Croatian coastline in order to cut off Dalmatia's access to the rest of the country, but they failed. So the Yugoslavian Navy just renewed their blockades on Croatia's main ports. As October of 1991 rolled around, the fresh Croatian army put together both Operation Utpost 10 and Orkan 91. These operations aimed to retake a ton of the territory lost to the JNA initially, and led into a successful counterattack. They even managed to sink and capture a few of the Yugoslavian naval vessels that blockaded the Dalmatian ports. It's kind of crazy. They're just stealing Yugoslavia's flow, bar for bar.
This shit ain't nothing to me, man.
By the end of 1991, Croatia still had a lot of territory to make up for, but they expanded their military drastically. So in January of 1992, the UN sponsored a ceasefire in the area, and Croatia was officially recognized by the European community as a sovereign country. With all those international eyes on this conflict, the UN became increasingly involved, creating the UN PROFOR, or the UN Protection Force, specifically for managing the fingers that they would put into these wars. This is kind of just the beginning of these conflicts too, and thousands of lives had already been lost and hundreds of thousands displaced. So there was an increasing desire for this conflict to be put to an end immediately by international voices. January 2nd, 1992, there was a ceasefire that was sponsored by the UN, leading to the official Yugoslavian army, or the JNA, to withdraw from Croatia. This did not mean an end to the fighting though, because there were still the Serbian proto-states and the proto-state paramilitaries running around vying for control of the land. But okay, so here's where it gets a little bit confusing, so bear with me. This war kind of extended into a whole separate country, the country called Bosnia and Herzegovina, in October of 1992, becoming a part of a whole separate-ish war. Like, they're connected, but they're considered different wars. But we'll get into that later, so don't you worry. The next year, in 1993, the Croats launched another offensive called Operation Maslenica, and they wanted to take northern Dalmatia from the Serbian forces. The Serbian forces at this point could be referred to as the RSK. This would give them access to a secure route between Dalmatia and southern Croatia. So it was tactically, it was like strategically pretty important. And the operation was a tactical success, but it was condemned by the UN, with Serbian sources, so mind you, they're Serbian sources, citing the deaths of 35 women and 3 children in the process. There is kind of a cool story associated with this offensive, though, that genuinely seems like something out of like an action movie. About 81 miles away from the Peruka hydroelectric dam, Serbs attacked the dam and planted 35 to 37 tons of explosives, like spread out evenly over the site of the dam in a way that would prevent the explosives removal. So after they retreated and were kind of pushed out of the dam, they attempted to blow the charges. Three of them did go off. But luckily, a guy named Mark Nicholas Gray, a lieutenant in the British Royal Marines and a UN military observer, he risked his career and lowered the reservoir levels beforehand. His actions are thought to have saved around 20,000 people who were living below the dam from drowning or having their homes completely destroyed. So props to you, Mark. So months would go by and there would be spats here and there, but no significant notable battles or anything like that. But they did create something called the ICTY, which stood for the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia. This was created in order to report and document and hold people responsible for war crimes through the series of wars that will happen. Anyways, Serbs continued their shelling, and the Croats, mainly near a town called Gospic, focused on stopping the artillery barrages, and they successfully drove these Serb forces away, but again, they took more flack from the UN for alleged war crimes against the Serbian civilian population. Like I said earlier, you'll come to see that although it's obvious that the Serbs were a huge root cause of a lot of these wars and a lot of the problems here in Yugoslavia, none of these people are good. Like, they all do. They all hated each other, and they went back and forth committing war crimes in the process. One side would do it, so they would do it back, and it was just retaliation back and forth. Fast forward to 1994, and that was the year the UN involvement really ramped up in efforts to finally put an end to the wars. Towards the end of the year, the UN began their bombing campaigns against the Serbian paramilitary organizations. They wanted to disable airfields and destroy Serbian anti-air defenses. Not too much happening in 1994, so we'll just skip ahead to 1995. Operation Summer 1995. See, they named it this because it happened in the summer of 1995. Was it summer of 1995? And Operation Storm. They named it this because Operation Storm is a cool name. Both of these kind of signaled the end of the war. They were both massive pushes on the Croatian side, successfully retaking Serb-held territory to the north and nearly all Serb-occupied territory in Croatia. Operation Storm specifically involved over 100,000 Croat soldiers and was one of the largest land battles fought in Europe since World War II. It was a total success. Operation Storm also had involvement in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. After that, Serbs really didn't have much ground to stand on, because the land had been taken from them. So Milosevic ordered the RSK to sign the Erdut Agreement on November 12, 1995. This agreement stated that the leftover occupied territory was to be returned to Croatia post-haste, and this turnover would be facilitated by the United Nations and their new transitional administration. Overall, this war resulted in 600,000 people being displaced and over 30,000 people KIA, both civilians and soldiers. I was originally going to list off all of the officially recognized massacres that happened in Croatia, but there's 98 of them. 98 officially recognized massacres in the Croatian War for Independence. Now, regardless of there being so many, I also just can't pronounce most of them, but just 98 massacres. Let that sink in. Now, I would say that this marks the end of it all. However, that's not true. There is way more.
But wait! There's more!
Remember when I said there was a separate-ish war that also involved the Croatians? Well, here it is. So in 1992, while Croatia was in the middle of their war, Bosnia decided to hop on the bandwagon. They declared their independence. A similar series of events kind of follows, except this one is super messy and involves a multi-sided conflict between the Bosniaks, who were the Bosnian Muslims, the Croatians, and, of course, the Serbians. Newsflash! They all hate each other! The Bosnians, mainly the Bosniaks, who were the Muslims, were loyal to the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I love saying that, by the way. Herzegovina. Ugh, rolls off the tongue. Or the back of my throat. Their armed forces were known as the ARBIH, but I will refer to them as the ARB because that's easier. And sometimes they cooperated with the HVO being the Croatian force within Bosnia, who were there to protect Croatian interests in the region. Now, again, these two did not get along, but their common enemy was the Serbs. In this case, the VRS. The VRS were the Army of Republika Srpska, which was the Serbian proto-state in Bosnia. And of course, the VRS wanted to remain in the Yugoslavian conglomerate, just like the RSK. Now, there's a lot of speculation on when the war officially started, but there were clashes between the Bosniaks, the Croats, and the Serbs as early as February of 1992. The Serbs consider the Sarajevo wedding shooting, where the groom's father was shot after the Bosnian independence referendum a day prior, to be the start and to be the first victims of the conflict. In April of 1992, after a series of killings on both the Serbian and the Bosniak side, war totally broke out. And it started with the Battle of Kupris, fought by the Yugoslavian army and the Croatian HVO. Now, the battle lasted a little over a week and resulted in a victory for the JNA, or the Yugoslavian army. During the Battle of Kupris, Serbian forces turned their artillery towards Sarajevo and began their trademark of indiscriminately shelling it. Serbians, once again, not exactly doing themselves any favors here for their international image. Full-scale hostilities had broken out by April 6th of 92 because on that day, the United States and the European Economic Community officially recognized Bosnia and Herzegovina as an independent state. The Yugoslavian army started to evacuate their personnel from blockaded positions, and the Bosnian government ordered that the JNA be expelled from the country entirely, which led to some conflict between the parties in early May. Serbian forces eventually overtook the city of Prijedor, while the ARBA and the Croatian forces both set up and operated the Celibici prison camp, which was used to detain 700 Bosnian Serb POWs, 17 of which passed away in captivity. I'm really trying not to upset YouTube with this harsh language and harsh topic, but damn, the topic really does make it very hard, so bear with me. In May, the Green Berets, no, not those Green Berets, these ones, a Bosnian paramilitary group, fought along local gang members against a pretty messy and disorganized Serbian attack of the town of Sarajevo. The goal of the Serbian attack was to split the town in two. The very next day, the president of the newly established Bosnian state was officially kidnapped by the Yugoslavian army. They got his ass while he was at the Sarajevo airport, and they used him as a negotiating tool to gain the safe passage of JNA troops who were stuck there in downtown Sarajevo. In the same month, the VRS was established. Like I said, they were the official paramilitary of the proto-breakaway state, the Republika Srpska, who obviously sought unification with the Yugoslavian state. Simultaneously, Bosnia and Herzegovina also became a member state of the UN. Now back to Sarajevo, the Serbians continued to shell it with artillery, and fighting also continued to displace a ton of people. The number of refugees caused by this conflict rose dramatically, like around 2.6 million people around June of 1992. Eventually, the JNA was driven out of Sarajevo entirely after the endless heavy street fighting, but the Serbian paramilitaries still stuck around. On June 19th, 1992, a pretty notable fight broke out between the Bosnian and Croatian forces in a town called Novi Travnik. Like I said earlier, on paper, these guys are allied with a common enemy, but they still, they hate each other, which led to conflicts like this. So the Croatians had demanded that the Bosnian forces they abolish some of their existing institutions and they expel Muslim refugees, all within 24 hours. And of course, a lot of these guys were Bosniaks or Muslims, so they did not like that. And there was a meeting held between the two forces that was supposed to solve the issue. But, you know, as one does, they met up and they just started shooting each other. Now, this little spat, should you call it, only lasted about 2 hours. But by this point, the war is far from over, and they still have a lot of time to spend together. The UN tried to broker a ceasefire in Sarajevo in order to fly in humanitarian aid, but it didn't hold, of course. They never do. Both sides wanted the city and the airport way too badly for a ceasefire. In response, the Secretary General of the UN decided to give the Serbians an ultimatum that required them to stop the attacks on the city and allow the UN to occupy the airport. They also wanted the Serbians to place their heavy weaponry under UN supervision, and the Serbs actually complied. The Croatians and the Bosnian leaders came to an agreement for cooperation between the two armies, with the goal to establish military cohesion. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work, but that'll come later. Sarajevo and that damn airport still causing issues in the big 1993. This time, while the UN was transporting the Bosnian Prime Minister to the airport, they were stopped by a Serbian roadblock. There was like a 90-minute standoff before anything really happened, but then randomly, and I couldn't figure out why, like I could find no information on why they did this, but those UN peacekeepers that were in the armored vehicle carrying the Prime Minister of Bosnia and Herzegovina, they just opened the doors to this armored vehicle, and shockingly, a Serbian soldier just shot the Prime Minister 7 to 8 times in the fucking chest. I thought to myself, like, why would you open the doors? Then I learned that the peacekeepers were French, and it all made sense. Not to mention the French guys, they didn't return fire, they didn't call for backup, and mind you, backup was 600 yards away. They didn't attempt to detain the killers. That's why this whole situation is mad fishy, right? Because afterwards, the UN even refused to cooperate with the Bosnian government on conducting an investigation on who the actual killer was. Certainly sounds like some fuck shit to me, if you ask me personally, myself. Mr. Pilliam Skepticson. As you can imagine, this didn't really do too much for Bosnian relations with the UN, and I can only assume that this made them go totally fucking bonkers at this point in the war, because a few days later, the ARBA attacked the Serbian village of Skelani and decided to take their frustration out on 65 of the townsfolk, 6 of which being children. Not good stuff. One village definitely wasn't enough, though, and the Bosnians went on a spree, taking control of several villages by January 26th, and they effectively isolated the town of Kozeljak, which was under Croatian control. The UN felt like all of this was getting a little bananas. So they established a no-fly zone over Bosnia and Herzegovina, commencing Operation Deny Flight, which was meant to enforce this no-fly zone. 239 aircraft were contributed towards this effort, 108 of which being from the United States alone. Goddamn right, brother. God bless the USA and our military funding. This operation ended up being an ongoing thing for quite a few years and ended up dropping an ass load of bombs. Anyways, throwback to when I mentioned the cooperation between the Croats and the Bosnians and their goal for military cohesion. They broke it. In April of 1993, the tensions between them exploded, just busted all over the Zenica municipality. The Croatians were outnumbered and quickly defeated, leading to a mass exodus of Croatian civilians from the areas. Meanwhile, in a town called Trusina, the Bosnians decided to execute 15 Croatian civilians and 7 prisoners of war. The Bosnian armed forces totally flipped the script on the Croatians, and they held a who can war crime harder contest. Croatian forces retaliated with an attack on the village of Amici, reaching the Arba lines, and reportedly went house to house, burning them down and eliminating civilians along the way. Not good. Enter the Mujahideen. That's right, Mujahideen are in this too. They began to conduct their own attacks, first in the village of Militici, where they captured a bunch of civilians and took them to a camp. Once again, there was a ceasefire signed between Croatia and Bosnia. We'll see how long that lasts. Things got so bad in that area that the UN eventually authorized the use of force to protect their established safe zones. Bosnians already broke the ceasefire. That ceasefire lasted a whopping 45 days. Let's go! New record! The Arba quickly defeated the Croatians, took their spot fighting the Serbs, and continued eastward towards Zenica. Bosnian momentum was halted, though, when they suffered a defeat at the hands of the Croatians at the town of Zepci. The Croats also managed to successfully hold off a Bosnian attack in the Kosovo region. A few months later, September of 1993, the Bosnians committed to their largest offensive yet, titled Operation Neretva 93. The war front was 200 kilometers long, or 124 miles if you're normal. Operation Neretva 93 was relatively successful in the areas around northern Herzegovina, but didn't break through to the southern Neretva like was initially designed. And the war crimes really ramped up after this one. Trust me on that, buddy. The Bosnians with the Grabovika, then retaliation from the Croatians with the Stupnido massacres. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Just awful things. Circling back to Sarajevo, kicking off the new year of 1994, the Serbians returned with their artillery and reckless shelling, lobbing a 120mm mortar shell into the Markale market, which eliminated 68 and wounded another 144. This being one of the worst incidents in the war. The UN saw this and decided to crack down, requesting that airstrikes be carried out immediately at the request of the UN Secretary General. Subsequently, airstrikes were in fact conducted against Serbian artillery positions around Sarajevo. They were pounded pretty good. So good, in fact, that a few days later, Sarajevo had actually had its first casualty-free day in 2 years. Feeling the heat from Western munitions, the Serbians backed off and were instructed to remove their heavy weaponry from Sarajevo, and on a large scale across Bosnia. NATO came around and told them that it's either that or they get bombed back into a new Skyrim save. Things seem to be looking up a little bit in this horrific conflict. February 23rd, 1994, the hostilities between the Croats and the Bosnians officially ended, with a final ceasefire being signed and an official agreement mediated by the United States called the Washington Agreement. At this point, NATO begins to really take over, and they started shooting down Serbian aircraft. They shot down 4 Serb aircraft over Bosnia on the 28th of February 1994. Serbs saw this and took an opportunity to get their get back and decided to kidnap 150 UN personnel. The point of this was to discourage further airstrikes in key strategic positions. November 3rd, 1994, the very first joint military effort between the Croatians and the Bosnians was conducted in order to retake Kupris from the Serbian VRS. And what do you know? They actually managed to do it. And they did it without shooting each other. So proud. NATO also held up their word and bombed VRS positions where they refused to remove their heavy weaponry. Serbs were not ready to give up, though. Not yet. Morale was down, but they weren't done. They occupied a Serbian safe zone in Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia, but the Croatian forces effectively dissolved the Republika Srpska on August 4th, 1995 with Operation Storm. Remember when I mentioned that? Well, I mean, after this, the remaining Serbian paramilitaries kind of just said, fuck it, we ball. They decided that the Markal massacre needed a sequel, so they did it again. This time it was a little less severe, but still certainly a war crime nonetheless. After Operation Storm, the airstrikes continued relentlessly, while Croatians and Bosnians simultaneously closed in on the remaining pockets of Serbian resistance in Bosnia and Herzegovina. On Thursday, October 12th, 1995, there was an official 60-day ceasefire, which translated into peace talks that were actually held at Dayton, Ohio, my home state. A month later, the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed, marking the end of the Bosnian War for Independence. We got one more to go. We're almost there. There are two things you never ask a man. How to spell Ica, or what he was doing in Kosovo from 1998 to 1999. All right, let's get this started. Now, tensions between ethnic Serbs and the Albanian Muslims in this area, the area of Kosovo, have always been a thing. The war's official start date is 1998, but events that would build up to it started way before. There were forced expulsions of Albanian Muslims from the Ottoman Empire about a billion years ago, and those expelled Albanian Muslims settled in the area that is now Kosovo, and that's why they're there. Now, major violence between these different groups wasn't uncommon either. There was fighting in the First Balkan War, World War I, World War II, there was an Albanian revolt in 1912. So while it was under Tito's control, like he set out to do, nationalism was pretty suppressed, so there really wasn't as much of a problem. Tito actually put some special love, thought, and care into Kosovo. From 1948 to 1963, there was a whole specific and deliberate crackdown on Albanian nationalism. In 1955, he declared a state of emergency to deal with Albanian terror groups. And Tito's efforts were, once again, pretty successful. I'll give him that much. But just like the other three wars, when poor Tito passed away, provincial powers in Kosovo devolved mainly to ethnic Albanian communists. And just like the whole of Yugoslavia, the economic problems brought the nationalists back. Right? So it started in 1981 with protests in the city of Pristina, where students at the university there held a mass demonstration. Because of that, it inspired others, and protests spread throughout Kosovo, into more than just that one town. Yugoslavia responded and sent in riot police and even the army, resulting in some Albanian casualties, furthering tensions between the two. Those tensions continued to grow, and in July of 1990, after Serbian authorities closed the Kosovo Assembly Building, 114 ethnic Albanian delegates gathered and declared Kosovo an independent republic within Yugoslavia. They didn't technically have the power to do this, but they were doing this, announcing to the world that, hey, we are our own nation state. Yugoslavia decided to institute a new Serbian constitution on the 28th of September in 1990, and there were unofficial elections held by Albanians for the establishment of independence. Serbia started to increase security drastically, implementing curfews, firing hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians from their government and state-run positions. Most Albanian schools were closed, and remaining Albanian teachers were asked to sign loyalty oaths, saying that they would recognize Greater Serbia and not the Republic of Kosovo. Ultimately, 350,000 Albanians left the region, and Slobodan Milosevic encouraged Serbian relocation to fill their place. And they did. So in 1993, Albanian repression was so widespread that even Albanian street names were changed. By 1995, Albanians saw armed resistance as pretty much their only option, so on the 22nd of April, 1996, 4 attacks on Serbian security personnel were carried out almost simultaneously in different parts of Kosovo. These attacks were conducted by the KLA, or the Kosovo Liberation Army. Now, the KLA wanted to establish a greater Albania, an Albanian state that stretched into Macedonia, what's now Montenegro, and parts of Serbia. They sabotaged Kosovo police stations, and they stockpiled weapons smuggled from the Albanian armed forces after the Albanian economy collapsed. A bunch of criminal organizations started stockpiling and selling these weapons from the Albanian armed forces, and a lot of them made their way to the KLA, of course. As far as I've read, the KLA were pretty much seen by all parties involved as terrorists. That included the Yugoslav government and the United States Special Envoy to the Balkans, but United States international relations didn't classify them as such officially. But in early 1998, because of the increased KLA activity and attacks on Yugoslav authorities, more Serb paramilitaries and JNA forces poured into the region to retaliate against the KLA. They targeted sympathizers, political opponents, and plenty of civilians and fighters alike, all of which losing their lives in the process. Early on, Serbian police found one of the founders of the KLA, a man named Jashari, and his followers in the village of Donje Prikaze. They engaged in a huge firefight and made sure that there was plenty of collateral. The damage was 60 Albanians dying as a result, about 18 of which were women and 10 were under the age of 16. Not good. Didn't really bode well with the international community, as which you can probably tell is a common theme with Serbians in this conflict. And we already know that the Serbs weren't seen in the best light at this time. Well, Yugoslavian forces would turn their sights to the village of Glajane, hoping to subdue the KLA presence there, but even though their numbers and firepower were superior, they failed to accomplish their goal. Glajane would end up being one of the strongest Albanian strongholds in the entire war. Milosevic was getting pressure from Boris Yeltsin out of Russia to stop the offensive operations and to start peace negotiations with the Albanians. But the Albanians refused to speak to the Serbian side, kind of understandably, for most of the war and for the events that led up to it. But shockingly, a meeting between Milosevic and the president of the Republic of Kosovo was made. It happened. There was help from an American diplomat named Richard Holbrooke. He plays an important role because he essentially threatened Milosevic, saying that if you refuse this meeting, quote, what's left of your country will implode, end quote. Later, Richard would visit the borders of Kosovo and he'd take a picture with the KLA. That picture got pretty famous, and all the Albanians and KLA fighters seeing this picture, it gave them the impression that the US was wholeheartedly backing the Albanian side during this conflict. So you can imagine it was probably a pretty big morale boost. Now back to those peace talks and the meeting between Milosevic and the Kosovo president. They didn't work. They didn't go anywhere. And on May 31st, 1998, the Yugoslavian army launched an operation with the intent of clearing their borders of the KLA entirely. NATO saw this and conducted a massive show of force over the Yugoslavian borders just to show them that they're ready to drop the pipes on them if they need to. In mid-July, the tide of the war began to turn as the KLA began to occupy a bunch of villages in south-central Kosovo. The UN at this point was watching and expressed great concern over the 230,000 people that had been displaced by the excessive force used by the Yugoslavian army. Subsequently, they would start preparing for a limited military intervention in the form of airstrikes. They also demanded that all hostilities cease immediately. Well, they didn't. And here came the best year ever, 1999. Not the best year because of what I'm about to talk about, but because it was the year I was born. Bombings and attacks in urban areas in Kosovo were on the up and up, and Serbian war crimes followed right with them. There's the Rajak killings where Serbian security forces massacred 45 Albanian farmers 15 days after the massacre. There was an investigation on this, and the Serbian side conducted that they were armed combatants, but literally everybody else that conducted a investigation said that they were all unarmed farmers. So I think it's safe to say they were probably unarmed farmers and this was a war crime. 15 days after the massacre, NATO once again authorized airstrikes against the Serbians and their positions to try to compel them to comply with international demands. A peace conference was called in Paris, named the Ratatouille Accords, named the Rambouillet Accords, hope I pronounced that right, but the talks were a total failure, and NATO started bombing Yugoslavia into oblivion. Oh yeah, and during this time they accidentally blew up the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Oops. But the bombing worked, and Milosevic accepted terms of a peace plan on June 3rd, 1999, only after a contentious debate between all the delegates who almost got into a fistfight over the ordeal. Understandably so when you're facing a bunch of war crimes and a war criminal tribunal. Bombing campaigns were suspended, and NATO troops made their way into Kosovo. This was the end of the Kosovo War. Ugh. far as the aftermath of all this goes, Milosevic was arrested, but he died while awaiting trial for war crimes in 2006. Yugoslavia was dissolved and would be reconstituted to Serbia and Montenegro, and the wars that broke it left 140,000 dead, millions displaced, and left the Balkans with even deeper scars and unresolved ethnic tensions. They still all hate each other. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, make sure to leave a comment, subscribe, like the video, and go check out my merch at musclepilled.com. Bye-bye. This video is definitely not getting monetized.